Hello my darlings. So recently I posted a video on TikTok about Arusor, which is the original world I've been developing for about as long as I can remember. It ended up blowing up a little bit and I got a lot of comments asking, how? So here I am to tell you how. I want to preface this video by saying that everybody's world building process is unique. What I'm about to give you is not a steadfast set of rules, but more so some guidelines, some general tips and tricks that I've learned over the years, and some resources that I really love to use. I have a lot to say, so this is going to be a series. And today we're just going to start out by talking about the general basics of world building and how to get started. Throughout history, people have been enamored by the idea of fictional worlds. From King Arthur's Camelot all the way to Middle-earth, Narnia, and Hogwarts, all sorts of stories have been centered around worlds and places that don't exist here. When faced with such iconic worlds, it can be a little overwhelming to figure out where to start. And the thing is, it is overwhelming. It's a lot of work and you have to be really committed to creating your own world. But I promise that the end result is so satisfying. My dog is here. 1 minute. Do you want to say hi to the camera? Come say hi to the camera. Gussie. Just come here. Come closer. Say hi. Okay, we're back. Now I'm going to tell you something about world building, and it may sound really discouraging at first, but hear me out. The thing about world building is that your world will never truly be complete, and I promise that's a good thing. The thing is, there's so much detail you could go into that you could continue writing about this world for the rest of your life. Once you get the basics down, you have to go into the little tiny details. All of a sudden you'll find yourself writing about that one obscure fashion trend from that one specific country during this one specific time. But because there's no real end goal in sight, that means that you can develop your world however you like. You don't have to worry about meeting a certain potential or a standard. You just write what you want to write. Take things at your own pace, do things how you want to do them, and eventually it will come together to form a world. But there's really no time frame as to how long it should take you and how much you should do to finish your world, because it will never actually be finished. However, there are some good steps to take to make sure that your world at least makes sense, so let's get right into it. Before you can get into the details, it's a good idea to have at least a basic understanding of how your world works, and in my opinion, the best way to do this is by making a map. I love fantasy maps. They can honestly make or break a book for me. If I'm reading a book and there's no map in there, I'm going to lose interest. And having a map is really good for your own personal use while you're developing a world too. It gives you a frame to work around, and something that you can always look back to when you need to figure out where to go next. Now, when you're starting out, you don't have to have a perfectly detailed map. You don't even have to put any names on it. For example, here are some of the maps I've made of Arusor through the years. This is the first map I ever made of Arusor. As you can see, it's very simple. I made it when I was around 7 or 8. I knew that there was a big continent up top and a big continent at bottom. There was a big empty area called the Deeps, and there were a bunch of smaller islands, but that was about all I knew. I made this map when I was about 13. It's a lot more detailed. And this is the current Arusor map. It's even more detailed and everything's set up pretty much the way it should be. So while eventually you may get to this point, you don't have to draw a map like this at first. In fact, I don't recommend it. You can get too caught up in the little details without fully understanding the big picture. Start with something like this. I like to call it a blob map. Basically what you do is you figure out what the basic shapes of your world are. For example, is your world one entire continent, or is it a series of continents? Or is it mostly small isles like Arusor? If you're still not sure where to start, there are plenty of resources out there that can help you. I really recommend Asgar's Fantasy Map Generator, Dungeon's Fantasy World Generator, and RollForFantasy.com's map generator. You can use these resources to generate a completely random map and get inspiration from that. I will be linking those websites in the description of this video, so if you're interested in them, go check them out. Now it's time to draw the blob map. All you're going to do is draw a bunch of random shapes to place the general idea of what you're wanting in your world. Draw some random shapes to represent isles, continents, put some stars in there to represent places where you want big cities to be, and remember, you don't have to name anything yet. This is just to give you a general idea of what your world is going to look like, and it will help you develop the basics of the rest of your world. For example, if your world consists of mostly islands, like mine does, it's going to make the borders of everything a little easier to figure out. Each island could have its own distinct government, and you don't have to worry about splitting it up as much. Versus on a larger continent, you'd have to define which rivers and mountains form the borders of different countries or provinces or regions. However, if you are on a larger continent, everything might be a lot more interconnected than isles that are separated by the ocean. Every type of map has its own pros and cons, and I recommend you just create the kind of place you want to see. There are a few other things that you should take note of before you start delving into the details of your fantasy world. First of all, is there magic, yes or no? Believe it or not all fantasy worlds have to have magic. If there is magic, how important is it to your world's society? Are there certain types of people or places where magic is more prevalent? What are some of the different types of environments you want to include in your world? Once again, you can just figure out which types of places you enjoy writing about. If you like stories that are set in big mountainous regions, add a lot of mountains. If you like stories that are set in forests, add a lot of forests. We'll talk about splitting those different environments up in a future video. Right now, just write down the kinds of ones you feel like writing about. Another really important thing to take note of is, are there other human-like creatures? For example, in Middle-earth, there are humans, but there are also hobbits and dwarves and elves. Does your world have more traditional fantasy creatures like elves and dragons, or does it have ones that you completely make up on your own? This is another matter of personal preference, but I personally really like to see fantasy worlds with creatures that aren't as often used. I feel like elves and dragons are used a lot in fantasy, and if that's something you want to write about, that's cool. But I really like seeing people come up with their own creatures or taking inspiration from creatures in cultures that aren't as often implemented in fantasy. This is also the time to do a lot of research. I really love the Wikipedia Mythical Creatures website. It has a list on mythical creatures from all around the world and links to more detailed pages on each one. But remember, we're not going into too much detail right now. Just write down the things that interest you and you can always change them later. This is just to get a better overview of your world. A world with just humans is going to be very different than a world with lots of other types of creatures. So if you have things like elves and dwarves, there are going to be certain regions that they might be more prone to living in, and there might be certain conflicts that happen between species. The more species you add, the more complicated it's going to get, so keep this in mind. And remember that you can always add more in the future. It's better to start small and add on from there instead of starting big and feeling overwhelmed and not knowing where to go forward. So already, by answering these questions and making this map, you have a basic idea of what your world is going to look like, and you can move forward from there. I recommend that you keep this type of process as you move forward. Start with the general big ideas and go into more details the farther you go along. Now before I go, I did want to talk about naming your world because this is another question I get a lot. There are many ways to go about this, but I'm going to introduce you to one of my favorites. Make a list of all the words you like. For example, some of the words on my list are ethereal, pearl, whisper, hush, wanderlust, peruse, and slender. Now mix and match bits and pieces from those words to create new ones. This way the words will include sounds that you like, and you might feel more of a connection to them. For example, combining some of these words could end up with slineth or endirial, which are two words that actually exist in Arusa. Another way to come up with names is by Googling fantasy name generators. The website fantasynamegenerators.org is a really great resource. Another method that I really like is looking through baby name books and finding old obscure names. Because these names have meanings, they can add a more personal touch to your world, and you can choose a name with a meaning that represents something that you want to represent in your own world. But remember that you don't have to name your world yet. You're in the very early stages of building it, and it's okay if it doesn't have a name. Sometimes you just have to wait for the right name to come around. Now that you have the basics of your world down, it's time to delve into geography, religions, languages, culture, and so much more. But we'll get into that. I'll be making detailed, in-depth videos on every single one of these topics and more, so stick around for that. But for now, I'm gonna say goodbye. I guess if you like this video, that means you could like and subscribe. I've never said that before. I guess that makes me a real YouTuber now. Also, make sure to check out the link tree in the description of this video where you can find all of my social media and also my Patreon where you can support me and ensure that I'm able to make more content like this while also getting some cool perks along the way. Thank you so much for watching. I'm really excited for this series to continue. If you ever have any specific questions about world building or you want feedback, my DMs are always open and you can always ask me questions. I love helping people out. Stay tuned for more videos. We're going to be talking about maps and geography next, which is a very exciting topic. I hope you have a lovely rest of your day and I'll talk to you later. Goodbye.